Hello and welcome to Global Lens. Over the next 30 minutes, we put the spotlight on all the top stories from around the world. I'm Parikshit Luthra. These are the top global stories we are tracking. Israel and Iran exchange strikes as the conflict escalates. Tehran says Israel carried out a fresh attack on the Fordo nuclear site, claims Iranian missiles hit a US military base in Syria. Trump warns of a regime change even as his deputy claims that they are at war with Iran's nuclear program and not with the nation. The world is divided over American strikes on Iranian soil. China and Russia slam the move. Arab nations express dismay but stop short of condemning Washington. Europe backs the US line, says Iran can never acquire a nuclear bomb. Flight operations in West Asia disrupted as the airspace over Israel and Iran remain closed. Oil prices hit a 5-month high over fears that the Strait of Hormuz could be shut down. Close to 20% of the oil consumed by the world is shipped via this waterway. The final decision on closing the strait lies with the country's National Security Council. Let's go straight to the day's market action. Global markets deal with mild aftershocks as the Iran-Israel tensions flare up. Here's how the Asian markets performed today. The Indian benchmark indices declined by 0.5%. Japan's Nikkei and South Korea's Kospi recorded minor losses, while China's Shanghai Composite and Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index gained 0.5%. European markets also experienced some sell-off as investors weigh the geopolitical risks. US stocks were little changed. Moving on to the top story this evening, Israel and Iran continue to trade strikes days after US President Donald Trump thrusted the United States into the war. Israel said that it has launched an attack into the heart of Tehran. It claimed to have struck the notorious Evin prison and security command centers. The Fordo uranium enrichment facility, which was one of the 3 nuclear sites to be targeted by the US Army over the weekend, was struck yet again. Iran launched a barrage of missiles targeting Israel over a 40-minute period. Tehran had warned that the United States may have started the war, but it will end it. This after President Trump warned of a regime change, even as his deputy claimed that they are at war with Iran's nuclear program and not with the nation. As oil prices soared amid escalating tensions and fears over the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, Trump has warned oil producers not to hike prices. He said, and I quote, "Everyone keep oil prices down. I'm watching. You're playing right into the hands of the enemy. Don't do it." Joining us now on the show to decode the impact of the conflict on the world and India is Jawed Ashraf, former Indian Ambassador to France and Singapore. Ambassador Ashraf, thank you very much for joining us. Let's start with the options that Iran has on the table. The Iranian foreign minister is in Moscow today to meet the Russian leadership. What do you think Iran can do next? What are their diplomatic and military options?
Well, thank you, Parikshit. I think Iran has a limited set of options at the moment. Let's first look at the short run, which is the immediate context of the conflict. It will intensify its attacks on direct attacks on Israel, as it is doing. But we have to see how much staying capacity it has. It has a limited, of course, number of missiles, and together with launchers, some have been used, some have been destroyed. So it may be able to carry on this for some time. It will get moral and diplomatic support and a modicum of material support from some of its allies or partners, including China and Russia at most. Its proxies in the region, Hezbollah in Lebanon have been, in a sense, destroyed quite significantly or degraded quite significantly. In Syria, Assad is gone. And, in Hamas, of course, is now been completely decimated in its ability to attack Israel in any meaningful way. Houthis are there, and they may be able to launch a few missiles at Israel. But remember, they're up against a country which is not only technologically and militarily advanced, but it has an unfettered support of the world's largest military power, and it continues to have the diplomatic backing of almost the entire Western world. So Israel will continue to attack, and I think it has 3 sets of objectives. Why I'm saying 3 sets of objectives? Because Prime Minister Netanyahu's objectives in the war since October 7 have kept evolving. First, from responding to Hamas to complete cleansing of Gaza, and then to attack all of the proxies of Iran, and now eventually to attack Iran directly. So one is, of course, the destruction of the nuclear capacity facilities, because you cannot destroy nuclear knowledge as such. Second would be the decimation of their military capacity, their leadership, and the capacities to attack Iran. And the third, of course, would be the far more dangerous and destabilizing possibility of seeking a regime change. And they do not discount that possibility. So we are up in terms of Iran with its limited capacities, but great will. I mean, here's a country that has an enormous capacity for resistance. We've seen that in the 1980 to 88 war against Iraq, when it was, in a sense, in disarray after the Islamic Revolution. We've seen that ability to withstand 3 decades of very punitive sanctions. And it is, in a sense, ingrained in its heritage, the sense of martyrdom and resistance from the Shiite tradition of Islam. And this is something that they recount to themselves all the time. So it has the will, it has the fierce capacity for resistance, but it may not be able to sustain a prolonged attack. So what it might also
Ambassador
do is that,
Ashraf,
just the last point, that as it seeks to intensify its response, it may also try to seek a back channel process of de-escalation and some sort of a resumption of a dialogue process, something in which the entire world is interested and invested.
all right. Ambassador Ashraf, aren't you also worried that Israel is being allowed to go after Iran, go after Gaza, completely unchecked, with no one to pull them back? We've seen the Gulf nations condemning the war, seeking de-escalation. Nobody's condemning the United States. Europe is condemning the violence, saying there should be de-escalation negotiation, but they're also saying Iran cannot have a nuclear bomb. In the current circumstances, who will hold back Israel?
Well, I think you raised the moot point over here. And, one of the things is that what you see is a complete disregard of international law and a complete impunity with which it is being done. And it just shows that the so-called international order has completely collapsed. It never was fair or even. And you see the double standards with which the Western world, approaches global situations. And so here you have you've seen what has happened in Gaza over these years. You've seen that even those who are seeking aid are being shot at. There is a complete effort to eliminate the presence of Palestinians over there. 50, 60,000 people have lost their lives. That's one part of it. But there is also the fact that, please remember, that Iran is not yet, legally speaking, in violation of its NPT obligations. There is nothing that prevents enrichment, and it has not yet said that it is developing a nuclear weapon. That it is accumulating 60% enriched uranium may be a cause of concern and for the world, but it by no means is a violation of the international law. The second point is that JCPOA was something which the United States pulled out of in 2018. And while these negotiations were going on, and there were 5 rounds of negotiation, and you remember that President Trump himself said so on May 15th, that they are close to reaching a deal, when he warned Prime Minister Netanyahu that we are in the process of negotiating a deal and want him against attacking. But there's something I wanted to say to you that, when I was in Washington, D.C., more than a decade ago, one very senior diplomats or official had told me that, Israel is one country that can get United States to do whatever it wants. And that is precisely what you see. 5 months into his presidency, a president who said he's all for peace and he's against forever wars, is once again dragging the United States into a war in the Middle East, against which he had spoken for so long, and which had also extracted a heavy toll on the United States that has led to some great economic consequences. So yes, you see that happening. And I have to say that for for Iran, there is the other problem that if it goes after the Straits of Hormuz, it will probably, sort of lose the support of some of its partner or some of the, some of
Like
the major
China.
countries like China, which is heavily dependent on it. It would also be a source of great concern for India and many other countries. As far
Ambassador
as the
Ashraf?
Gulf countries are concerned, while they have, and you raised a very important point here, I wanted to say that, for the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia and UAE, while they may get some relief from the fact that that Iran's nuclear program may have been set back by a decade, or maybe we still have to assess the exact extent of damage, and we still don't know where the 400 kgs of the enriched uranium is. Certainly, IEA has no idea where it has gone, but they have to also watch out because once Iran has been debilitated or weakened, there is going to be perhaps United States will no longer be in a position or will no longer be willing to back Saudi and UAE against Iran because Iran has been weakened, and may give greater space for Israel to try and assert its hegemony over the entire West Asian region. What that would lead to is perhaps a quest by the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia and UAE, in particular, to seek nuclear weapons themselves or some form of deterrence against what they have seen could be a unilateral action against which there is no barrier, there is no restriction, there is no global way to stop it. So you will see this also taking, translating into perceptions in East Asia, Northeast
Yeah.
Asia,
Right.
where, Korea and Japan would say that, look, you need to to look after yourself, and which means that countries with advanced technology will say, well,
Okay.
it's only a breakout into a nuclear weapon state. So
Yeah.
this is also going to be a great damage to the
Absolutely.
non-proliferation regime, and it certainly makes the world much, much more insecure. And if we are talking
Absolutely.
about
Worrying
regime
times there.
change, yeah,
Yeah.
and
So
if we
it's
are talking
definitely
about
true.
regime change, remember what the consequences of that were in this is going back to the neoconservative agenda of the late 90s and early 2000s, when they brought about regime change in Iraq against once again on the specious logic of their having weapons of mass destruction, which was proved to be wrong. They went after Libya once Libya had forsworn its nuclear program. They brought
Ambassador
about
Ashraf?
regime change in Afghanistan. So we are looking at a longer term consequences which go beyond simply the
Absolutely.
outcome of this war.
All right, Ambassador Ashraf, thank you very much for joining us. You really summed it up very well. There are multiple layers to look at this conflict from, and possibly what Israel may be looking at is not just a regime change in Iran, but also hegemony in the larger Middle East region. And this is something that will make a lot of countries in the Middle East very uncomfortable. And clearly, there will be consequences for India as well. We're not aligned.
And
We
Parikshit,
have been
just
neutral so far. Yeah.
one more country which we should not forget about: Turkey, a pretty significant power, which a history, centuries old history of having dominated that region. How it is going to see this, and Turkey is an interesting place. It's a NATO member, but also with great influence in the region and very close partnership with Russia as well. So
Right.
how it sees this vacuum and how it seeks to place itself in this will also have very strong consequences for the region, for Europe, and for the Mediterranean.
All right. Thank you very much, Ambassador Ashraf, for joining us with those very sharp views on the Middle Eastern situation. A quick look now at the other headlines we're tracking. Israel has said that it has recovered the bodies of 3 captives held in the Gaza Strip since Hamas's 2023 attack. This comes as the Israeli military's attacks in the besieged enclave killed more than 30 Palestinians. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said that the pressure Israel has put on Iran is helping its mission in Gaza. At least 7 people have been killed and dozens have been wounded in a massive Russian drone and missile strike on Ukraine's Kyiv and the nearby region. The attack sparked fires in residential areas and damaged the entrance to a metro station, bomb shelter. 4 children were among the injured. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, and preliminary reports indicate that ballistic weapons from North Korea were also used. The White House has confirmed that President Donald Trump will attend a high-stakes NATO meeting tomorrow in Hague, Netherlands. NATO's member nations are poised to approve a proposal to raise their defense spending target to 5% of gross domestic product. This is in line with US President Donald Trump's demand. However, Spain has said it received NATO approval to opt out of the spending target. Prosus CEO Fabrizio Bloisi has placed a bold bet on India's tech sector, stating that the country is poised to produce a $100 billion tech company in the coming years. He says that Prosus is not investing in India to sell next month. In a conversation with CNBC, he added that Prosus is aiming to replicate the returns it earned from its early investments in Chinese tech giant Tencent. Trump Media and Technology Group, the parent company of Truth Social, has announced a $400 million stock buyback with approximately $3 billion on their balance sheet. The company says it is well positioned to boost shareholder value and pursue new strategic opportunities. President Donald Trump is the largest shareholder, who indirectly owns over 114 million shares via a revocable trust. The stock gained in pre-market trading. Oman will impose 5% income tax on top earners by 2028, becoming the first Gulf nation to implement this measure. This charge will be imposed on individuals earning 42,000 riyals or above on an annual basis. Chairperson of Oman's Economic Association has stated that this measure aims at reducing the nation's dependence on oil refineries and also stabilize social spendings. With an eye on the 2029 elections, Nigel Farage-led Britain's Populist Reform Party has unveiled the Britannia Card, a proposal that offers foreign newcomers and non-domiciles a 10-year permit and tax benefits. All this in exchange for a one-time payment of €250,000. The party says that the proceeds earned would go to the people living on the lowest incomes. It's time for a short break. We continue the conversation on Israel-Iran conflict on the other side, and also the role of US and what it could do in the months to come. Welcome back. You're watching Global Lens. America's targeted strikes on Iran raise the risks for the global economy. BMI, a Fitch Solutions company, expects oil prices to remain elevated over the near term. It also estimates that if oil prices rise to $100 to $120 per barrel, it could push up global inflation by up to 1.2 percentage points and cut growth by about 0.1 to 0.2 percentage points. This could raise fears of a recession and also impact the monetary policy of central banks. We're now joined by Cedric Chehab, Chief Economist at BMI. Cedric, thank you very much for joining us here on Global Lens. Let me ask you about the current situation related to the war in the Middle East. The markets are pricing in a temporary de-escalation. What would be your outlook on crude oil prices going forward?
Markets seem to be pricing in a little bit of a de-escalation. So if you look at oil prices, they've come off from about $81 back to around 78. At the same time, the probability of the Strait of Hormuz being closed off, according to different kind of betting markets, is below 50%. So in that regard, we think that oil prices will probably still remain between the 70 to 80 level. And that's just as markets price in a somewhat of a potential de-escalation. So from here, we see two broad paths forward. So the first one is the potential for a contained Iranian retaliation, and then that leads us to a de-escalation and would potentially include dismantling of the nuclear program in one shape or another. And there is precedent for this, just because if you remember in 2020, after Trump ordered the assassination of Iranian General Soleimani, Iran provided some advance warning of a strike on a US base, deliberately seeking to avoid casualties. However, there is a probability, of course, that Iran instead chooses to retaliate more aggressively by attacking US assets or trying to close the Strait of Hormuz. If that's the case, then what we could see is an escalation in tensions with the US attacking Iran directly. Oil prices could potentially move to $100 per barrel or even higher. And that would potentially also lead to greater uncertainty with regard to maybe the prospects of regime change, energy flows, etc. So for those reasons, we are quite concerned about where we are. But for now, markets seem to be pricing in a little bit of a de-escalation.
Right. Cedric, what I would also like to ask you is about why US struck Iran. When Pete Hegseth was speaking, it seemed as if they had a limited objective of hitting Iranian nuclear sites, especially Fordo, and that has been achieved. But then you had Donald Trump giving all indications that they're looking for a regime change. Now, if that were to happen, how do you think oil markets and the global economy would be hit?
I think that's a very good question. And I think, as usual, we're getting some mixed messages from the US administration. So on the one hand, as you mentioned, Pete Hegseth and also JD Vance, they were very quick to articulate that essentially the attacks were on the nuclear facilities and not on Iran itself, and that they didn't want a prolonged war or forever war, as they call it, and they don't want boots on the ground. But then, of course, Trump threw his kind of off comment on Truth Social, where he said, he suggested there could be some regime change. I think the point there is to say that while the US preferred path is for de-escalation from here, that they're not afraid to re-engage and escalate the situation even more and potentially push for regime change if negotiations are not possible. And I think that's been essentially the modus operandi from the Trump administration, right? He basically said earlier, we'll negotiate. There are 60 days to negotiate. If not, we'll see. And those 60 days were up. And then he essentially gave the tacit approval for Israel to start attacking Iran. And then, of course, over the weekend, the US got much more involved in those direct strikes. Now, the risk, of course, as we mentioned, is that this escalates into a much more kind of regional conflict whereby Iran starts to attack US assets. And then that will bring the US back into attacking Iran. I think for now, the US is done. But if Iran were to attempt to close the Strait of Hormuz or potentially attack any US assets and kill any servicemen or women from the US, that would certainly result in the US getting involved and re-engaging. That, of course, would then lead to a greater escalation. And I think more concerns for the general security, just because if the Iranian regime is seen to be going down, then potentially they might pull out the last stops in terms of firing more aggressive missile volleys, right. Potentially trying everything to defend their regime from collapsing.
Okay, let me also ask you about the impact on India. Currently, the Indian government does not foresee any disruption in terms of oil supplies. They've said that we are less reliant as far as oil flowing through the Strait of Hormuz is concerned. We have a diversified oil supply chain. But on the whole, what is the kind of outlook on India in the midst of this crisis?
Absolutely. So you're right that Indian reliance on the Strait of Hormuz is much lower than other Asian economies, but I think it's still around maybe 40 to 50%. So it's not small. So I think there are some supply chain risks from that regard, but much lesser compared to other Asian economies. But I guess for the Indian economy, this poses downside risks to four main areas to the macro outlook. So the first one is, we already expect the Indian economy to slow from about 6.5% last year to 6% this year. This is strong growth, but already weaker than before, and any escalation in oil prices or uncertainty would reduce this further. Second of all, higher oil prices and weaker growth would weigh on the fiscal forecasts for the country. You could see a wider fiscal deficit, possibly something above 9% that we're currently forecast. And then third, although the current account deficit is in much better shape than it had been in the past, a sharp rise in oil prices could lead to a wider fiscal deficit than we're currently forecasting, which is about 1.5%. And of course, the last component is related to monetary policy. So inflation has been low, but if we have an oil shock, then that could lead to higher oil prices, and then that could impact the path for monetary policy and what the central bank will do.
All right. My final question about the possibility of recession. Are you expecting a recession sometime later in the year, or a mild recession?
So for now, we're not pricing that in. We haven't made any significant adjustments to our global forecasts. We had already made several adjustments in April and May based on the tariff situation. But for now, if oil remains around 80 or below 80, then we think that the global economy can digest this uncertainty, particularly if it's over, let's say, in a month or several weeks. This is because if you remember, in the second half of last year and in early Q1 this year, In fact, oil prices were trading around $70 to $80 per barrel. And so oil prices around current levels are what we've seen for the past 6 to 9 months or so. So I would be more worried if oil prices would start going above 90. So 85 to 90, that would start testing, I think, the limits, and we would start revising down our forecast. So as a short answer to your question, we're not seeing a recession just yet, and that's because we expect oil prices to remain relatively contained, as we don't expect the Strait of Hormuz to be closed.
Thank you so much, Cedric, for joining us. Clearly a worrying situation for the global economy. Let's move on and take a quick look at all the stories that are trending. Tesla's much-hyped robotaxi service has been launched in Texas. The first rides, priced at $4, were being offered in parts of Austin. A small group of influencers were invited to participate in the closely monitored pilot. Tesla CEO Elon Musk touted the moment as the culmination of a decade of hard work. Thousands gathered in Sao Paulo, braving the rainy weather to celebrate the city's LGBTQ+ Pride Parade. This year's parade theme, LGBT+, aging memory, resistance and future, spotlighted challenges faced by elderly members of the LGBT+ community, including ageism, loneliness, healthcare barriers, and the lack of inclusive public policies. Global environmental group Greenpeace unfurled a banner in Venice calling for tech billionaire Jeff Bezos to pay more taxes. The banner read, and I quote, "If you can rent Venice for your wedding, you can pay more tax." End of quote. Bezos is getting married to journalist Laura Sanchez in the city this week. The Oklahoma City Thunder have won the NBA Finals with a 7-game triumph over the Indiana Pacers. This is the Thunder's first NBA championship since the franchisee relocated to Oklahoma City in 2008. 26-year-old Shai Gilgeous-Alexander was named NBA Finals Most Valuable Player after leading the team to victory. On Final Cut this evening, anti-war protests have erupted across the globe after the US carried out strikes on Iranian nuclear sites. In Iran, tens of thousands gathered in cities including Tehran, Isfahan, Mashhad, chanting "Death to America." Iranian President Pezeshkian also joined the rally in the US. Demonstrations spanning major cities like New York, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C., where protesters carried signs reading "Hands off Iran." Protesters also erupted in London, Berlin, Karachi, Tokyo, and across South Asia. We leave you with these visuals. That's it on tonight's edition of Global Lens. Goodbye, and thanks for watching.